Hi, everyone. My name is Nermeen Shaikh. I'm a producer at Democracy Now! And also a weekly co-host. I want to thank the Culture Project for organizing this extremely important and timely event and discussion. Research indicates that only 2% of drone attack victims are top militant leaders, as against what we are told when we are told anything at all about what are, after all, covert strikes. There have been between 400 and 800 civilian casualties in Pakistan alone since 2004. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our two speakers who know a lot more about this topic. Medea Benjamin, to my left, is co-founder of Code Pink and Global Exchange. She's just returned in November from Pakistan, where she went to drone-affected areas with Imran Khan, who is a leading political figure in Pakistan and one of the people most critical of drone strikes. She met drone victims. She was also in Gaza in December. Her latest book is called Drone Warfare: Killing by Remote Control. To my right is Sarah Knuckey. Sarah Knuckey is one of the co-authors of an extremely important report, which I also urge you all to look at. We had Sarah on Democracy Now! As well. She's the co-author with Stanford Law School and New York University Law School of a report called Living Under Drones. She's the director of the Project on Extrajudicial Executions at NYU's Law School, and she's recently been appointed advisor to the new UN Drones Inquiry, which was just launched last Thursday. So I'd like to begin by asking Sarah about this report, Living Under Drones. Can you say a little about what you found and the kinds of people you spoke to in Pakistan, how many people, and how this report brought out things that we were not previously aware of from the other research that's been, however, limited on drone strikes?
The starting point for us in doing this research was that if you only read US media, US press about these issues, the overarching narrative we have from anonymous officials quoted in the Washington Post or the New York Times, or most analysis of the drone strikes, is that they are extremely surgically precise, is the phrase that's used over and over. And very rarely do you ever read accounts in any detail of any civilian harm whatsoever, or any of the broader impact, or any of the downsides. So what we wanted to research was, if this is the starting point in a program that is completely unknown and covert to us, the public, what can we find out? So we went to Pakistan and spoke with a large number of NGO experts, journalists who work in the areas, people who said that they were injured in drone strikes, whose family members were killed in drone strikes, to ask them about the impacts. We looked at a very small number of strikes in a lot of detail to see what kinds of evidence could be obtained about any alleged civilian casualties. And then what we realized in speaking with people was that while the impacts there were, of course, civilian casualties and injuries, that the impacts, the sphere of the impact was so much broader than that. And that was the piece that was, until that point, almost wholly unreported in the US press, at any rate. So for us, four main concerns come out of this work. First is that there is significant evidence of civilian deaths and injuries from US drone strikes. We're talking only about Pakistan. The Bureau of Investigative Journalism, which has been collating all of the media reports on each of the drone strikes over the years, their estimate is that between 2,500 and 3,500 people have been killed in Pakistan. Of that, they say that 400 to 800 people have been reported as civilians. The harm beyond that is what we really focused our investigations on. That means that when a person is killed in a drone strike, it is also the family that suffers. If a man was killed in a strike, who now is going to pay for the school fees of his children? If a house was destroyed of a civilian, who is going to compensate the family who now no longer have a home? People have become afraid in certain areas to gather together in groups because the understanding is that a number of strikes have taken place against militants gathered together in large groups, and so people are afraid that this might be a signature of militant activity. One of the most troubling impacts that came out from speaking with humanitarian workers at international humanitarian organizations who had worked in the area. They said that because of the risk of double taps or a second strike after a first strike, that their organization prohibited them from doing medical rescue work at a drone strike zone within 6 hours. And these are medical doctors who were prohibited from attending to a strike zone because of the risk or the fear that they might themselves be subject to a second attack. The third and fourth concerns are around strategic and policy considerations. Are the strikes making us safer, or Pakistani civilians living in these areas safer overall? Here, the evidence is very ambiguous. As mentioned earlier, about 2%, this comes from CNN collection of data, 2% of those killed were high-level militants, which means the rest are a mixture of civilians or low-level fighters. And if that's the number, but it's causing intense hatred towards this country, there's anecdotal evidence of increasing recruitment towards terrorist organizations, then we need to be asking very serious questions about to what extent these policies are making us safer. And then from a legal perspective, at the moment, the United States is one of a very small number of countries that has the capacity and has been exercising that capacity to carry out armed drone strikes. But more than 75 countries now have drones. Only a small number of those are currently armed. But every couple of weeks, there's a new article out about a new country that is seeking to obtain armed drones. The last to announce this was Germany. And it won't be long before the proliferation of armed drones continues to increase. In this context, the precedent we have being set now is that one country is being allowed to kill whoever it says are its enemies, and some of them certainly are and may be, but it is allowed to kill whoever it says are enemies in another country with zero public accountability, with zero transparency, and there's no oversight on top of that. And if that's the precedent that we are setting, and if the international community doesn't rein that in, then we're saying to all other countries that this is an acceptable policy, that you can go into another country and kill whoever you say is an enemy, and no one is allowed to ask you the legal basis, any factual basis, who is this person, or to do any post-strike investigation to see if there were, in fact, any civilian casualties. We did a lot of interviews with individuals who were either injured in strikes or whose family members were killed or injured, or who witnessed strikes. Some of the most striking of the interviews, one in particular with a humanitarian worker who had worked in the area. He had also actually was in New York on 9/11, and so he was relating to us the kinds of fear that he had felt right after 9/11. And he said, I remember right after the towers were hit, the fear that we all had, that we didn't know what was coming next. And he said, when I worked in Fatah, where the drone strikes were, even though I was a humanitarian worker, and of course, the safest person in the region, actually, he knew that rationally, but when the drones would fly, he just would say, I never know if the intel is wrong, or if they might misfire, or I'm near someone who is the target, but I'm collateral. And so he said, whenever they were flying, that he would feel terrified. And he said the fear was a similar anticipation that you just don't know, and there's nothing he or others could do to protect themselves in that area.
And Medea, you just returned from Pakistan in November, and you traveled with Imran Khan. Can you tell us a little about the areas you were in and the people whom you spoke with?
I also want to mention, in terms of the terrorizing, that I was recently in Gaza, and a young woman who was with us, she's from Gaza, said something to me that sticks in my mind, because she said, everybody thinks that drone is for them, that it's your own personal drone. And she said she thought they could fly these Israeli drones. She said they could fly higher and you wouldn't hear them. But she said they fly lower so we can hear the buzzing all the time. And it's just this way of telling us, we're watching you, you don't know when you're safe, there's no place safe to be. And so I think one of the great things about the Living Under Drone study was to get out that we are using terrorism to fight this war on terror and terrorizing people in the process. I wanted to talk about a couple of examples in Pakistan. And the first one is a chance that we had to meet with a man called Karim Khan. I think we're going to put his picture up here. Karim Khan is a journalist. In fact, he's worked for Al Jazeera and a number of other media outlets. He lives a lot of his time in the capital city of Islamabad, but his home is in the tribal areas in Waziristan. And one night he got a call in the middle of the night. It was actually on December 31st of 2011, and he was told that a drone had hit his compound. Now, his compound means his home. This is what was left. What you see in this picture is the compound totally destroyed. And in the process, his son was killed and his brother was killed. Now, the brother, he told us, was the director of the local school and had come back, a well-educated man, come back to the village because the Taliban were in that area, and he wanted to teach the young people that it was much more important to get an education than to pick up a gun. And Karim Khan's son came back after he finished high school and wanted to also work in the local school with the same idea of teaching the young people how important education was. And so when Karim Khan told us his story, he said, imagine what the 200 children from that school learned when the drone strike killed their beloved teachers, and that these children were left aching for revenge. And so when we talk about what is the result of these drone strikes, it is a recruiting tool, and the best recruiting tool for Al-Qaeda and for the Taliban. I wanted to talk about two other cases. One is the case of a 16-year-old. His name is Tariq Aziz. He lost his cousin, a young cousin, in a drone strike, was very upset about it, and he was given the opportunity to go to Islamabad and participate in a gathering that was called by lawyers from Pakistan and from the UK, who the first time ever gathered up drone strike victims' families to talk to them about what can we do. How can we use the courts? How can we do better documentation of the drone strikes? Because it's important to know that these drone strikes are taking place in areas that are off limits to journalists, which is one of the reasons it's so hard to gather good information. So Tariq Aziz was in Islamabad for 4 days in a very publicized gathering. The media was there. He was staying in a very well-known hotel. And he was one of the young people who was taught how to use a video camera so he could become a citizen journalist. And he was very excited about his role of documenting these drone strikes, because he said that in his village, the drones were buzzing overhead 24/7. The gathering of people, little did they know that 2 days later, while he was driving with his younger cousin to pick up an aunt, a drone strike hit him, and this is all that remained of Tariq Aziz. Now, the lawyers who were in that meeting were outraged, and they said, why was he killed? The U.S. government said he was a militant, because any young man of military age in the area is deemed a militant. And they said to him, he was in a public meeting. If you thought he was a militant, why didn't you have him arrested? Why didn't you give him a chance to surrender? And there's no answers for those questions. And the last case that I wanted to bring up was the one of a U.S. citizen, Abdul Rahman al-Awlaki. This is the son of Anwar al-Awlaki, who was a very fiery imam who gave a lot of anti-Western sermons, was an American citizen, went back to Yemen, was put on a kill list by President Obama, and killed in a drone strike. Well, his son was born in Denver. These pictures come from his Facebook. On his Facebook, he talked about how he liked rap and hip-hop music. He liked to swim. He was, his friends say, a ordinary American teenager. When he was taken back to Yemen to live with his grandparents, he was having a cookout one evening in the ancestral village with a bunch of young friends, all teenagers, when he was hit, and the whole group was hit by a drone strike. This is an American teenager. And the groups like the Center for Constitutional Rights and the ACLU have been trying to get information through the courts about the killing of Americans. And so far, they have been unable to get any information. And just think about the killing of an American citizen, a young boy, 16 years old, without any kind of judicial process, and where our government feels no obligation to even explain what happened. And I just want to put it in the context of President Obama when Trayvon Martin was killed. Remember that? Trayvon Martin from Florida, and how he was killed by George Zimmerman, and it was so horrible that President Obama himself stood before the media and said how awful this was, and said, if I had a son, he might have looked like Trayvon Martin. And I think it's important to look at the picture of Abdul Rahman al-Awlaki, because if President Obama had a son, he could very well have looked like Abdul Rahman al-Awlaki. And yet there is no sympathy for the killing of this young man. And as I said, absolutely no explanation.
It's important to point out that the U.S. is not at war with either Yemen or Pakistan where these drone strikes are occurring. On the contrary, these countries are allies of the U.S. So I wanted to ask Sarah to comment on what Medea said, and on the legal bases, not only of the drone strikes in general, but in particular the case, and this is actually what Medea talked about, Anwar al-Awlaki and his son, they were killed within 2 weeks or 3 weeks of one another last fall. What it means that the U.S. government is targeting U.S. citizens abroad.
The al-Awlaki one is interesting because there's actually a number of legal cases there, and they really highlight the absence of any path to have any real accountability here. So it was found out that al-Awlaki, the father, was put on a kill list, and this was known before he was killed, and so the Center for Constitutional Rights and the ACLU sought to challenge that in court. The case was thrown out. He was then killed, as was his son, and then there was another lawsuit challenging the legality of that killing. That one's still ongoing, but the government's response to the lawsuit so far is to say this is a political question, meaning these questions about whether we are at war, who we are allowed to kill under what circumstances, are only for the executive. They're not for the courts to decide. Because of the inability really to use U.S. courts to address targeted killings or drone strikes, there have been attempts to use courts in other countries as well. So in Pakistan, there have been a number of lawsuits, all ongoing, attempting to hold both Pakistan and U.S. officials to account. Pakistan on the basis that it has obligations to its citizens to protect them. There was just a case recently thrown out in the UK where the plaintiff was seeking to hold to account any British authorities who provided intelligence information to the Americans on the basis that if they knew that they were providing intel to carry out targeted killings, that they also had legal liability. That was also thrown out and is now on appeal. So all of the cases and attempts there have been to use the rule of law so far have gone nowhere, and this led a Yemeni lawyer who's very active on Twitter about drone issues, maybe you saw this, Medea, tweeted that if one of his children were killed in a drone strike, that he would join al-Qaeda because it was the only path to any justice. And I hope he was just speaking in a rhetorical manner, but a lot of people see it that way, that there is no way through the courts to have accountability, and so what are their options? There's been some fantastic reporting from Yemen by McClatchy Papers. Unfortunately, we don't see this kind of reporting in the New York Times or the Washington Post, but a strike there that killed a man in November last year, just outside of the capital, a well-known individual. Unknown whether or not this person had a link to Al-Qaeda or other terrorist groups, but he was killed in a drone strike. The reporters went to the area shortly afterwards. The entire village was saying to him, "We all know this man. He's previously been arrested and released. This is not a faraway area where police can't access. If you thought that he was a terrorist, why didn't you just come and arrest him?" And all the quotes from the individuals, family members, neighbors were saying, America preaches rule of law, but to us this looks like hypocrisy.
Can I ask you, though, it's very interesting. How is it that the U.S. can say that in a case like this, it's the executive that has power and not the courts? Is there, I mean, what's the precedent for this kind of thing in the past?
It's a constitutional separation of powers question that for matters of war making and decisions under war, that it's for the executive and that the courts can't come in and question those decisions. The bigger issue here is, of course, are we at war? And who gets to decide and what does that mean? So I'm hesitant often with non-lawyers to speak about the legal frameworks because I think it's the most boring aspect of all of this. But it's crucial to determining the legality of a lot of the strikes engage extremely complex, for lawyers, questions. And the legal issues, they get conflated, they're very badly reported. There's two separate issues with the legality of any of these strikes. One is it lawful to use force in the territory of another country? That's one set of questions that is about the legality or illegality of interstate use of force. Is it lawful for the U.S. to use force in Afghanistan or Pakistan or Yemen? That's one set of questions. The rule there is no. States are sovereign. You are not allowed to violate that sovereignty, but there are exceptions to that, including if the state consents. So as Yemen, for example, has consented to U.S. drone strikes in Yemen, there's no violation of Yemeni sovereignty. Pakistan is more complicated. They, for a long time, were in the public saying that they did not consent, but then it later came out from WikiLeaks cables that it appeared there was a kind of covert consent. Now they are again extremely public, saying that they do not consent, that the strikes are a violation of their sovereignty, and that the strikes are counterproductive. But the U.S. might also be able to use force in Pakistan if it can show that it's necessary for self-defense. The test there is that in the face of an imminent threat, that the U.S. is allowed to protect itself through the use of lethal force. That's one set of questions. Another set is whether killing a particular person is lawful vis-a-vis that person, regardless of the violation or not of state sovereignty. And this is why it matters so much whether or not we're in war. If there is, in fact, an armed conflict, then the rules of international humanitarian law apply. And they do permit a state to kill members of a group with whom it is in an armed conflict. That is separate from the law that applies in peacetime, which is human rights law, which prohibits all killings unless they're strictly necessary to protect life. This is why it's so important, this question of are we or not in war and with who, because that determines for most of the strikes whether or not they're lawful.
Well, then there's also the issue about is it legal according to the U.S. law? And there the justification is that this is all part of the authorization for the use of military force. You remember that piece of legislation that was passed in the haste of the post-9/11 attacks where Barbara Lee was the only congressperson who voted against that? You all remember that? Some of you remember that? And that said specifically, it's people who were involved in or associated with the attacks on 9/11. Now we are killing people who maybe were 9 or 10 years old at the time of 9/11. And it even seems that today with the discussion about expanding drone surveillance and possibly attacks into Mali and other parts of Africa, that they are already justifying that on the basis of that same piece of legislation, the authorization for the use of military force. So it stuns me as a non-lawyer, but somebody who actually thinks the rule of law is supposed to apply, that the Obama administration, run by a constitutional lawyer, let's remember, is continuing to stretch this authorization for the use of military force and to stretch the idea of what constitutes an imminent threat in terms of the international law.
Well, Medea, the constitutional lawyer you mentioned was, as we all know, inaugurated for his second term last Monday. And of course, he didn't mention the secret drone war at all in his inaugural address, but he did say that a decade of war is now ending and that lasting peace does not require perpetual war. At the same time, he's nominated John Brennan to be the director of the CIA. John Brennan, as some of you may recall, was called by some the assassination czar. He was the first Obama administration official to publicly confirm drone attacks overseas and defend their legality. Can you comment on this nomination and what it might suggest is coming in the second term of Obama's presidency?
Well, it's astounding to me that somebody like John Brennan, who was unconfirmable in 2008 when he was first proposed because of his intimate involvement under the Bush administration in the CIA and his known advocacy of enhanced interrogation techniques and of extraordinary rendition, that when he was proposed back then, he was deemed unconfirmable, and so he withdrew his nomination. 4 years later, when he not only has that history, but add to that this past involvement, in fact, being the mastermind of this drone program, somebody who what I would say has been involved in acts of murder in these last few years. And suddenly, there doesn't seem to be a lot of controversy about this nomination. And we are going around now to the different Senate offices and trying to say, you know, will somebody stand up in the Senate and say this guy was not confirmable then, and he certainly isn't confirmable now? And we can't find, so far, a senator who will stand up to that. And what does that say about our Congress? What does that say about how far we have strayed in the last 4 years under the Obama administration? Because if this were happening under the Bush administration, there would just be so many people yelling and screaming about it, and certainly the legal community would be doing so. And now we have more discussion and more debate about Chuck Hagel, who's getting his nomination confirmation hearings next week, than there is about John Brennan. So it astounds me. John Brennan's confirmation is happening on February 7th. If any of you would like to make the trek to Washington, D.C., we feel it's really important to pack the hearing room for his confirmation. And if there are not senators who are going to stand up and say, this guy is not fit to be the director of the CIA, at least there should be citizens in the audience who are willing to get up and say that.
The morning of the inauguration, there were strikes in Yemen.
That's right. And 3 people were killed, I believe. Right?
Reportedly.
Yeah.
Again, will there be an investigation into that? You know, but we really have to ask what it means that there were strikes the day that the president said that the war is ending. And does this mean that the strikes will stop, or that they will not apply the laws of war and they will apply the very strict rules of human rights law, which would make most of the strikes unlawful, it appears on the available evidence? Or does it mean that war no longer means or rather that if drones are used, that it's not war? But to go to your question, the UN has been involved in looking at drone strikes since the very first ones in 2001, 2002. The first one actually was referred to by the UN as a clear case of an extrajudicial execution. It was a strike in Yemen. Since then, there have been investigative missions to Afghanistan and to the United States to look at particular sets of raids that were targeted killings, or to ask broader policy questions around drone strikes. Through most of that time, most of the countries involved have not been very cooperative. And have essentially refused to answer in any depth any questions, saying that the UN officials doing that work didn't have the right kind of mandate or the right kind of jurisdiction to ask those questions. And that, however, over the last year, it seems has been changing. So in June this year at the Human Rights Council, which is the human rights body of the UN composed of states, Ben Emerson, who's a British lawyer, and he has the mandate to look into issues of human rights and counterterrorism and report to the UN on those issues. He raised some of the issues about where's the accountability for drone strikes, and a number of countries asked him through the Human Rights Council to investigate particular cases or patterns or policies and to report back to the General Assembly on what he found. What he said at that time was, there's clearly a need for an investigation. As with all human rights violations or alleged violations that happen in any country, the first place where investigation should happen is at the national level. There's no need for international inquiries. In theory, most of the time, it's up to domestic mechanisms to investigate. And so he put the onus on to the United States and saying, well, this is what everyone is alleging. It is time to investigate them, but nothing happened since then. So late last year, he announced that the UN would be undertaking investigations into issues of the relevant legal frameworks that apply to the killings in various countries. And he also decided to take a very close look at a subset of strikes, so between 20 and 30 perhaps, to look at the kinds of evidence available to see whether there is a need for a war crimes inquiry of a much higher level. So he'll be taking information from victims, families, NGOs, certainly officials from the United States, from Pakistan, from Yemen, from Somalia, from Israel, to see what can be found out and to bring all the data together. And he'll be reporting to the General Assembly late this year.
And Medea, you've done a lot of work around this issue. I mean, going to Pakistan. Can you say a little about what people are doing, both to raise awareness of the issue, because we've just talked about the fact that very few media cover it at all, and McClatchy, as you mentioned, and Democracy Now! What are people doing to raise awareness of the issue, and how did you come to organize this trip to Pakistan, to all of these areas, which in some cases is quite difficult to get to?
Yes, quite difficult to get to. In fact, going up to the tribal areas, they told us they hadn't seen Americans there in 10 years. And it was quite frightening to go. We had a delegation of 34 people. And I say frightening because the U.S. ambassador came to meet with us at our hotel in Islamabad before we were going to go in the caravan to warn us not to go. He had his security person come and tell us not to go. The day we were going to leave, he sent me an urgent message, said I had to meet with the security people, and they said, we have credible evidence that the Taliban are going to try to blow you up. And I asked, could we get any idea who that credible evidence is? And he said, of course not. And I talked to the group, and amazingly enough, everybody except one person decided they still wanted to go. So it was a remarkable group of people who went, and getting up to this area where the only thing they have seen from the United States since 2004 is drone strikes and a real hatred of Americans. An important thing to know of the hatred of Americans, it crosses ethnic lines, class lines, ideological lines. There is a study that was done that said 3 out of 4 Pakistanis consider the United States their enemy. That's 133 million people. That's pretty dangerous for our security. And I wanted to read a quote that General McChrystal said the other day that you might not have caught. He was doing an interview on Reuters, and he said, "What scares me," him, the general, about drone strikes is how they are perceived around the world. The resentment created by the American use of unmanned strikes is much greater than the average American appreciates. They are hated on a visceral level, even by people who have never seen one or never seen the effects of one. So, it's not like our military doesn't know what's going on. So Narmeen asked about what's being done. First, I think it's important to say what's being done in the places that we are using those drone strikes, and that is a lot of mobilizing, a lot of protests. There have been in Pakistan, many protests with thousands of people on the street. They have even blocked the U.S. base that was used as a base to transport goods into Afghanistan, which I hear cost the U.S. $1 billion extra in transportation costs, not being able to use that base. In Yemen, there are regular protests against the drone strikes. And then in the United States, I'm actually feel very positive about the change in the attitude of Americans in the last year, because when I was writing the book, Drone Warfare, Killing by Remote Control, it's when some polls came out that astounded me that said that 83% of Americans thought it was okay to use drones to kill terrorist suspects. And that included even a majority of people who define themselves as liberal Democrats. Now that has been changing dramatically in the last year, whereas the last poll I saw said 63%, and even less when it came to women. And I think that is because there are many groups now that are out there educating, mobilizing, talking, going to universities, going to faith-based groups. There is a lot of mobilizing, and you have some of the best people here in this audience who are going to speak to us. And in upstate New York, outside of Hancock Air Force Base, there is a fantastic coalition of groups that have come together and done what they called a Gandhian wave, where they keep going out. This is one of the bases where the drones are being remotely piloted. So they go out and they get arrested, and they come back with more people, and they get arrested, and they come back with more people, and they use the trials as a time to talk about international law. And this is happening not only in upstate New York, but in several places around the country. So more and more people are getting involved at the bases themselves. More and more people are getting involved protesting at the headquarters of the drone manufacturers. And if you ask who's a drone manufacturer, every single weapons manufacturer in this country today is involved in drone manufacturing. And then there are universities that are doing research to see what kind of contracts their university has with the military to do research on lethal drones, and then trying to get those contracts canceled or at least raise awareness. And there are some divestment campaigns that are starting to try to get campuses to divest from companies that are involved in lethal drones. There's a mobilization that's happening in early April in San Diego, where the headquarters of General Atomics is, and that's the one that makes the Predator and the Reaper drones. There's another mobilization happening in upstate New York in April, a national one as well. So there's a lot more organizing going on, and I think that we are changing awareness, and this will eventually have an effect on our Congress and our administration and on the drone policy.
I'd also like to mention, actually, I meant to mention it earlier. Today I came across an article that's just come out in the Atlantic magazine. It's authored by Christine Fair and a couple of others. And it reads, "You say Pakistanis all hate the drone war, prove it." And in the article, the authors make an argument that all of the polls, what Medea, what you were citing, basically rely on inaccurate or insufficient data to conclude that Pakistanis are opposed to these drone strikes. So I think it's not only a question of the fact that drone strikes are not covered in general, but that the coverage they get is not necessarily uniformly one thing. In other words, one of the most problematic points she raises, or they raise in this article, is that a large number of the people who are interviewed only have access to either the Urdu language press or the vernacular press, and therefore those people are less informed than people who have access to the English press, because the English press gives a more complicated picture of what drone strikes are about. So I think that we can think about that and what that means.
The prove it point too raises a really interesting issue. So we're in an environment in which the government tells us essentially nothing about the program. In court, they refuse to even acknowledge it exists. There are strikes on a weekly basis. There are never official statements about who was killed or how anything we do know about decisions, how decisions are made, and the nature of the program all comes through either excellent journalism or by anonymous leaking to journalists. In that environment where there's a complete black hole of information, when people do come out and alleged victims say, you know, my leg was blown off in a drone strike, or my mother was killed, or my child was killed, the critical response to that often is, prove it. Prove that you are a civilian. And a lot of people will say, in fact, many of the people, Medea, you met with, Sarah, that you met with, in fact, are Taliban or Al-Qaeda who are making up stories. You know, it's propaganda. So we have this fascinating reversal in which anyone who was killed or injured was guilty, and then it's up to them or their family members or NGOs to prove innocence, which is A, impossible, and B, the opposite of what it should be. The case should be that if you're going to kill a person, that you have met a standard that, in fact, you know, satisfies basic due process, and if there are credible allegations of civilian harm after the fact by family members or others, that the government has to answer those.
Well, it's quite Orwellian, and I decided when I came home from Pakistan that I was so incensed. We gave a couple of examples to the ambassador in Pakistan, the U.S. ambassador, and we said, here's 3 cases. Just give us the information about these 3 cases, what really happened. And one of them was Tariq Aziz. And so a member of our delegation, a Pakistani who was a lawyer that is investigating these cases, he got a call from the U.S. Embassy, and they said, can you put me in touch with Tariq Aziz? We would like to interview him. And this lawyer, Shahzad, said, you killed him. He's not around.
For an interview.
So I thought when I came back, I wanted to find John Brennan and get a chance to talk to him. So I thought, I wonder if I can find his house where he lives. And started just doing a little Google search, and I have no particular skills at all in this. And I found a John O. Brennan. And I thought, okay, there's probably a million John O. Brennans, who knows? But you know what? I'm going to go to his house. What the hell? It was a Sunday afternoon, a nice ride into Virginia, Herndon. So we took a ride over to this place. And I went up to the door, and I knocked on the door. And who should answer but John Brennan? And like my heart was like, and I looked at him and I said, John? And he said, yes. And I was like, I really didn't expect to find this guy. I didn't know what to say at that point. And I said, well, I just got back from a trip and I wanted to talk to you about it. And he's looking at me and his wife is coming to the door and he's like, a trip? And I said, yeah, to Pakistan. And then you could see his face like what, ashen, like what is this woman coming to my house to do? So I got a chance to chat with John Brennan at his house. And the first thing he said to me is that we were being manipulated. That's what he said. He said there are virtually no innocent people that have been killed, and we are being manipulated. So it's that kind of Orwellian thing that you were talking about, Sarah, that we have to prove something that we can't prove because this entire program is secret. And that's another Orwellian thing when I went to the court to where the ACLU was arguing with the government over getting information, and the government is saying, what drone program? What drone program? You have no proof that there even is a drone program. So that's how crazy this whole thing gets. And one other tidbit that shows how insane this is that people on the Intelligence Committee in the Congress have not even been able to get copies of the legal memos that give the U.S. justification for this drone program, and particularly for killing Americans overseas. And there was a letter that Ron Wyden, a senator on the Intelligence Committee, put out in terms of what he's going to ask John Brennan. That's a very angry letter, and it says, for 2 years, I have been asking you for these legal memos, and I'm on the Intelligence Committee. Do you think you could hand over these legal memos? And the other thing he says is that for years I've been asking, could you tell me what countries we are using lethal drones in? Because I have not been able to get that information. So imagine this is who's supposed to do oversight, and they can't even get this basic information.
I'd like to ask, actually, both of you, because it seems kind of logical or commonsensical. I mean, you quoted General McChrystal, Medea, and the piece that we saw by Shana Solomon suggests the same thing. And your report, Living Under Drones, suggests that these drone attacks are actually increasing the likelihood of violent attacks against the U.S., in other words, as revenge. It seems to be a completely logical thing to think for everybody. The fact that they're increasing these drone strikes, that there continues to be no oversight, and at the same time there seems to be some sense from people like General McChrystal that this is a situation that is, I mean, it's eternal war for eternal peace, as against what Obama said in his inauguration. So could you comment on that?
We need to separate out all of the different factors that go into a decision about how to carry out policies like this. Mm-hmm. What we get from the press in the US and from the government is, of course, only the pros, and those need to be taken into account together with the downsides. This report is not against killing certain kinds of enemies when necessary, and it's not against drones as such, or even killings by drones in Pakistan or Yemen as such. The issue is with, first of all, the complete lack of transparency and accountability, and second of all, the absence of knowledge about what rules apply, and then significant evidence of both the counterproductive nature of them and civilian harm. On the pro side, it seems clear that drones have killed some number of high-level militants and have disrupted terrorist networks, and have probably prevented some number, I don't know how many, I've never seen any studies, of attacks against both Pakistanis and American soldiers in Afghanistan. That needs to be weighed against, and again, very little empirical evidence to make sound policy decisions about if that's the upside that you're aiming for, is that being counterbalanced or outweighed by increasing recruitment, by increasing general hatred towards Americans, which decreases not just even in terms of security, but our diplomatic relations with Pakistan and many other countries, which may be undermined by this. And then the horizon upon which you make a judgment. They might be wise policy under certain security considerations for the next 6 months or the next 5 years, but what happens when your horizon of judgment is 10 years or 20 years? What are we doing both to long-term harm in terms of recruitment, but the very legal frameworks that govern the interrelationships between all states? And the risk right now is that we are really undoing the protections that were created after World War II to limit human rights violations. And that the danger as proliferation increases, if other countries mimic these practices, what kind of restraints will exist, could possibly exist in this environment. I don't remember who it was now, but a former US official did an NPR interview where he said jokingly that he felt really bad for whichever US spokesperson was going to have to speak out or find a way to speak out when some other country carries out drone strikes. And like how he would criticize this and sync it with US policy. Alleged Department of Justice memo which apparently lays out the legal basis for U.S. drone strikes and targeted killings. This is a memo which the ACLU and the Center for Constitutional Rights and the New York Times have been trying to obtain through litigation and so far have not been able to. It seems to perhaps be one of two. There's some other anonymous source and there might be another similar memo, and they're perhaps the precursors to what at one time was called the disposition matrix and now is maybe being called the playbook or the rule book, which outlines both the processes for decision making about this decision to undertake a strike and put someone on a kill list, and then also the laws that apply to that. Although we just learned last week that the playbook, while it was nearly finished, would not apply to the CIA in Pakistan, which is
or in Afghanistan.
Which is where almost all of the strikes are taking place. First of all, they're only writing the rule book. I can't call it a playbook. They're only writing a rule book now, and yet all prior statements are that all of the strikes were lawful. But if the rule book didn't exist, or the rules were different between different agencies, on what basis can it be accurate to say that they were all lawful? And then again, if the exception undermines completely the rule here, and again, we don't know what the rules are to either get on a kill list or the legality of a strike.
Medea?
Well, I want to take the last part about the domestic drones and throw it back at Shahid around the NDAA, because he's doing such wonderful work on that I think it's important that people know about it. In terms of the domestic drones, you know, you might be wondering, and it came up in our conversation, sort of why is it happening? Well, one of the reasons is it's big business. And there are not only a big, powerful lobby of drone manufacturers, but they are so powerful that they have their own caucus in Congress. It's called the Unmanned Aerial Systems Caucus. So imagine that somebody is elected by we the people, goes to Congress and says, oh, it's my job to get more drones in the world. And that's what they're doing. And so they force through a piece of legislation that says, that was written by the drone manufacturers, who are worried about the winding down of the war in Afghanistan, already winding down the war in Iraq. They're saying, well, wait, we got to have more places to sell these things. Let's sell them right here at home. And let's sell them to the police departments. And there's 18,000 police departments. That's great market for us. And so they have been pushing the Federal Aviation Administration to open up the U.S. airwaves to drones. Now, the FAA knows something that a lot of people don't know, which is they crash all the time, very unsafe, and that there's no rules about our privacy. And so they've been reluctant to do it, but now the legislation says they must open the U.S. airspace to drones by September 2015. And there are already several dozen police stations that have gotten their testing permit from the FAA. And you might say, but you know, all these police departments are getting budget cuts. Where's this money coming from? Coming from Homeland Security. And Homeland Security is giving grants to police stations to buy these drones and then to train their officers to use them. So it's very worrisome if you are somebody who cares about civil liberties and all of the civil liberties that have been taken from us since 9/11 already. You should be extremely concerned about the prognosis that there will be 20 or 30,000 drones in our airspace in the next decade. And communities are starting to have a discussion locally, meet with their police departments, put rules in place. The ACLU is getting involved in different communities to say, if you're going to use these drones, they must be used in this way, and there must be guarantees for privacy and safety. And then there are no drone resolutions that some groups are trying to pass. And all of these can be found on our website called droneswatch.org. And there's a wonderful organization, the Electronic Frontier Foundation, that is collecting all this information from communities to keep in a database. So you might want to check that out as well.
I think his name is Stephen Graham. He's an academic in Britain. We had him on Democracy Now! A few months ago. And he talks about, in his new book, I think it's called The New Military Urbanism, the increasing militarization of police departments. And some of the things he talked about, I mean, I was utterly stunned, and I tried to keep my looking utterly stunned off air, but it was really shocking that these police stations in the U.S., just local in, you know, wherever, are acquiring tanks, automatic weapons, and drones, that police officers are increasingly coming to resemble military people. Now, what does that mean? What does that mean for a democratic polity?
Drones are being posited as an alternative to American troops on the ground. And it's part of a recognition by those in power in the Obama administration that the American people are tired of war. The American people are tired of seeing Americans being killed, and they don't understand what for. And this is a way of waging war behind the backs of the American people. It is a covert program and it doesn't put U.S. lives directly at risk, although it does indirectly because of the hatred and the blowback that comes from this. Secretary of Defense Leon Panetta said the drones were the only game in town. Well, it's not just drones. It's cyber warfare, it's small commando groups, but it's alternatives to large numbers of boots on the ground. And we see the U.S. not only using the drones where we know, because as I said, even people on the Intelligence Committee in the Senate don't know the whole picture, in Pakistan, Yemen, and Somalia, but setting up drone bases in places throughout the Middle East, in Djibouti, in Ethiopia, in Burundi, and now they're talking about drone bases in Niger. So this is the way of keeping a perpetual war going without the American people really even knowing or caring much about it, because Americans are not getting killed and they're being told about how this is a cheap way to fight the war on terror.
Some of the early work on drones, a lot of the thinking about it was in terms of remotely piloted killing and whether that the geographic distance would lower the threshold for killing and would increase the capacity of individuals to just sort of do a trigger war. But some of the new research that's coming out looking at PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder is that individuals, the drone operators themselves, are actually reporting quite high, and for many people, unexpectedly high levels of PTSD, because they're sitting there watching individuals on the ground for many, many hours at a time. And some of the footage they have is very close up. They watch, a family or a group over many hours, perhaps many days or weeks. They follow their behaviors, then they watch the strike, and then they watch it afterwards too. And so they see a strike after, which is very rare for a pilot actually. And then they leave and go home. So part of the question here also is, what impact is it having upon the people we're asking to carry it out for us?
I have a chapter in the book on drone warfare about the pilots because I think it is important, and I've had a chance to talk to a number of them, both outside the bases as well as on Twitter, just kind of putting the word out there, anyone want to have a conversation. And they are very conflicted about this. And then you talk to people in the military, and there's a lot of people in the military who are opposed to the use of drones, especially drones in the hands of the CIA. They say the CIA is a civilian agency, it's not a military agency. They say there's no accountability in terms of the CIA, and many of them say that the CIA is out of control in its use of drones. So there are allies inside the defense industry, the military complex, that we should and are reaching out to. In terms of the countries that have drones, the majority of them are buying them from Israel. Israel is the #1 exporter of drones.
Yeah, but mostly those are for watching, looking.
Yes, but so the ones who already have armed drones are the U.S., Israel, China, Russia, the UK, and France. As Sarah said, Germany being the most recent one, Italy, Turkey is trying very hard to get armed drones. The Predator and the Reaper drones were originally a reconnaissance drone,
yes,
and then they were weaponized. Can you bring them down? Well, the Iranians insist that they brought down a very, very sophisticated U.S. drone. A professor with $1,000 worth of equipment from the University of Texas in Austin showed how he could bring down a drone. It's known that right now drones are really useful when you're fighting in a place that has no air force, but if there is an air force, the drones are not going to be very useful. I would say unlike Latin America, or some of you might have had a chance to go to Cuba, you find people who always say, we are against the policies of the government, but not against Americans. You don't find that clear separation when you go to a place like Pakistan or even a place like Yemen. They don't have as much information in the tribal areas, for example. They don't get a chance to meet a lot of Americans. And so I think, when we talk about blowback and the danger, because there is not that clear separation, we are considered culpable. The U.S. military should protect us here at home and not go around the world creating enemies.
I would like to thank, on behalf of the Culture Project, both Medea Benjamin and Sarah Knuckey, and thank you all for coming. Thank you.